This is the podcast to help you get ready for the Northwest Allen County Schools Life Science Common Assessment in the 6th grade that's coming up during finals week. It's actually divided into two separate parts because it's actually a pretty long review. So first of all, the first part will cover Chapter 8 vocabulary and then the concepts for Chapter 8. And then we'll move up. Then the part 2 will cover Chapter 9 vocabulary and then Chapter 9 concepts. I'm going to leave out the stuff on the short answer because I'm actually covering it during the chapters, and so just make sure you go over those sections a little bit more in detail based on your study guide. To start out with, this is the part 1 video, and so we'll start on the chapter 8 vocab. The first word we need to talk about is organism, which is a living thing. This followed then by habitat, which is an environment that provides the things a specific organism needs to live, grow, and reproduce. Then we had biotic factor, which is a living or once living part of an organism's habitat. And of course, if you have biotic, you also have abiotic, which are the non-living parts of an organism's habitat. We then talked about populations, which are all the members of one species living in the same area. And this then relates into communities, which are all the different populations that live together in a particular area. Then there's ecosystem, which is the community of organisms that live in a particular area along with their non-living environment. And population density, which is the number of individuals in an area of a specific size. And this is similar to the idea of regular density, which is the amount of mass in a given unit volume. And we calculate it using the formula population density equals the number of individuals divided by the unit area. And we'll go through an example in a little bit on that. We then had limiting factor, which is an environmental factor that causes a population to decrease in size, and carrying capacity, which is the largest population that a particular environment can support. Finally, we had adaptation, which is an inherited behavior or physical characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce in its environment. So let's start on the Chapter 8 concepts. The first concept was biotic and abiotic factors. And I want to draw your attention here real quick. Up at the top, you're going to see I always have a page number up here during the concept section. And that's the page from the textbook that you can also reference if you have additional questions. So with biotic and abiotic factors, you need to know what they are and identify some examples. So both are factors that the organisms interact with in their habitat. For example, and the important part to remember is biotic means living, and whenever you add that letter A in front of something and connected to the word, obviously the prefix A, it usually means non. So it's this case it's non-living for abiotic. So if we took a look at this picture of the bear here, of course the bear is living, so it's a biotic factor, but so is the grass in there. It's also a biotic factor. But the dirt in the water, though, those are abiotic factors because they are non-living and they never were living, and they never will be living because they're non-living abiotic factors. Now we take a look at the habitat then, knowing what it provides for the organism, we can see that it provides food, water, shelter, and anything else that the organism needs and other living things around there. And it does this so that organisms can live, grow, and reproduce. And so the habitat provides everything that an organism needs to be successful. It means they live, grow, and reproduce. Now when we look at the different organisms, we can actually classify them into different levels of organization. Specifically, an organism, which is the first or the lowest, most specific level, is a single species, which of course means that they can mate with each other and produce offspring. So any organism that is related to that point is considered a species. The population then is all the members of a species in one area. And then a community is all the different populations that live together in an area, followed by the ecosystem, which is everything in the area. So it's all the communities plus the non-living parts of the community, or the non-living parts like the dirt, the water, things like that. We can actually think of it in this idea of a tree diagram here. You can see that organism A, which is a specific species, is part of a population, which is all of those species. So for example, we could look at the cats and dogs in your neighborhood. The cat that lives in your house would be organism A. All the cats in your neighborhood would be the population. If you threw the dogs in, that'd be a different population living together. That becomes a community. And then when you throw in the houses, or actually, I'm sorry, the houses actually qualify as kind of in a different category there. But if we threw in the dirt and the water, those are the abiotic factors, and we end up with the ecosystem then. Next, looking at population density, you need to make sure you know how to find this when you're given the information. So remember, population density is just the number of individuals in a unit area. So let's take a look at an example here. Let's say, for example, there's 60 dogs in my neighborhood, and it's a big neighborhood that's 10 kilometers squared. And so if I take that and put it into the equation, I actually find that it's 6 dogs per kilometer squared. Notice I showed all my work here as I work through this because it's important that we write everything down because it helps to guide to make sure you're doing the problem correctly so you can get the right answer in the end. The next item were the limiting factors. You need to be able to identify what causes a population to decrease or stop growing. So a limiting factor causes them to stop growing or decreasing. There's lots of possible limiting factors such as weather conditions or the climate, space, that's referring to the amount of area that they have, food, and water. Of course, those are all relating back then to the factors or the parts that make up an organism's habitat. So anything that the habitat provides that there's not enough of can be a limiting factor. And this then ties into the carrying capacity, which is the largest population that an area can support, and it's based off of those limiting factors. And so usually the population we find stays near this level because if there's too many, organisms die off. There's not enough, organisms reproduce. If you think back to the bear activity, we saw this idea of carrying capacity. And if we would have ran that for several hours straight and done that multiple times, we would have found it ended up at about the same number every single time. Now, adaptations are the behaviors and physical characteristics that allow organisms to live successfully in their environment. So for example, an Arctic fox has fur that can change color to match its background. A lot of you found that out as you were doing your zookeeper investigation. So there's also things like markings being similar to poisonous animals or having poisonous spines or fangs. Lots of different things can help to protect an organism from being hunted, or also make them so that they can hunt more easily. Those are two examples of adaptations, which relates nicely into competition and predation. Remember, competition is the struggle between organisms to survive as they attempt to use the same limited resources. As I said, that there's the carrying capacity and the limited resources, and they're trying to compete in order to find all that. And so those limiting resources means, of course, there's not enough, and so they need to find food and the resources to survive. So they may need to find shelter or may need to find water. And it actually typically follows a cycle. We can actually see that when there's a high population of one, or a high population, we can actually see that it will go back down, it goes back up again over time. This is a very important thing. We talk about the idea of predator-prey relationships. Remember, predation is when one organism kills another for food or nutrients. Of course, then the predator is the organism that does the killing, while the prey is the organism that is killed. Now, there are a couple important characteristics for each one of these. Predators can have some adaptations to help them, such as running fast or sprinting, as well as like poisonous tentacles when you look at like a jellyfish. Prey, on the other hand, can have mimicry, which means they match other organisms. We see that sometimes with there's some snakes that look like coral banded snakes, but they're not, and they're actually a harmless snake. Me personally, I'm just going to avoid them at all costs, though. There's also the idea of the warning colors, which means that they're brightly colored and poisonous. For example, a poison dart frog. Those frogs have a very, very bright, vivid colors to them, and that helps to identify to other organisms that, hey, I'm dangerous. Stay away from me. You don't want to try to eat me. Symbiosis, then, is what falls into most of the other relationships fall into. And this is any relationship in which two species live closely together and at least one of the species benefits. Now, there are three main types of these symbiotic relationships, and those are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. We'll start out with mutualism and look at the idea here where both species benefit in this case, all right? And so that means that hummingbird and flowers is an example. If you look at the hummingbird gets a benefit because it gets nectar, flowers get a benefit because they are pollinated and it drops off the pollen to another flower in order to continue the species. Commensalism is when one species benefits and the other is neither helped nor harmed. Example would be a bird's nest in a tree. The bird gets a benefit out of it. It has a safe place for it to live. The tree, it doesn't do anything to it. Doesn't help it, doesn't hurt it, it's just there. And then finally, there's parasitism. And this is when one organism lives with, on, or inside another organism and harms it. So it actually causes there to be harm or takes things from it. The parasite is the benefiting organism. An example would be a flea or a tick. And the host is the organism that's being harmed. And we looked at a situation in our with the bear activity where we saw that the fleas cause harm to the bear. Now, normally parasitism does not cause death of the organism, at least not immediately. It's more likely that it just kind of causes it some harm and makes it more difficult for it to survive. The last thing in Chapter 8 is looking at the idea of primary succession. Now, primary succession is a series of changes that occur in an area where no soil or organisms existed before. And if we take a look at that, an example situation the book has is when a volcano erupts, then pioneer species of lichen and moss start to grow, and these are things that actually can help to break down. If you think about moss, it actually helps to break down rocks. Volcanoes produce lots and lots of rocks, and then the soil is created and new plants can finally grow there. All right, so that wraps up part one. So if you want to continue on, you can join us over on part two. If you have questions at this point, of course, you can jump onto My Big Campus and ask them on there. I already have a forum going on there, so please make sure you post them in there. And check also, somebody may have already answered it, or maybe you can answer a question for someone else.